On March 23, 1945, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stood before the world's cameras to claim his crowning glory at the Rhine River, unaware that General George Patton had already stolen his thunder 24 hours earlier. This is the definitive account of the most toxic rivalry in World War II, where Allied unity nearly buckled under the weight of two massive egos, forcing Dwight Eisenhower and Winston Churchill into a desperate diplomatic salvage mission. The Rhine River was never just a body of water flowing through the heart of Europe. It was the psychological spine of the German nation and a formidable liquid fortress that had defined European conflict for over 1,000 years. As the spring of 1945 dawned, this legendary barrier represented the final major natural obstacle standing between the advancing Allied armies and the industrial ruins of the Third Reich, a reality that Joseph Goebbels used to fuel his propaganda machine by claiming the river would become the grave of all invaders. Hitler himself had issued a draconian decree that every single bridge spanning the dark, cold waters must be demolished with brutal efficiency, leaving the Western Front paralyzed before a moat that seemed impenetrable to any force lacking massive, coordinated support. But as the German Wehrmacht obeyed these orders with methodical desperation, dropping massive spans of steel into the depths from the Swiss border to the North Sea, they missed a single vital opportunity at the town of Remagen. On March 7th, elements of the American 9th Armored Division seized the Ludendorff Bridge before its charges could be detonated, an event that sent shockwaves through the high command and provided a fleeting 10-day window for American forces to establish a foothold on the eastern bank. While this breakthrough was a tactical miracle, it did nothing to soothe the simmering tensions between the two men who believed they alone were destined to deliver the final blow to Hitler's heartland. Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, commanding the British 21st Army Group in the north, viewed the Rhine crossing as his ultimate set-piece battle, a meticulously choreographed masterpiece that would vindicate British arms and cement his place in the pantheon of great commanders. He had spent months obsessing over every detail of Operation Plunder, gathering 3,500 artillery pieces and preparing the largest single-day airborne operation in military history to ensure that when the British Army crossed, they would do so with the unstoppable weight of a modern empire. To Montgomery, war was a science that required patience and overwhelming force, a belief that made him view any deviation from his grand design as not just reckless, but a personal affront to his professional dignity. Directly to the south, General George S. Patton Jr. watched Montgomery's preparations with a mixture of contempt and predatory intensity, seeing in the British Field Marshal's caution a golden opportunity to prove the superiority of American aggression. Patton's operational philosophy was built on the holy trinity of speed, violence, and the ruthless exploitation of enemy weakness, and he had no intention of allowing a man he privately mocked as a tired showman to claim the headlines of the final victory. In the secret pages of his diary, Patton recorded his mutual disdain with blunt ferocity, describing Montgomery as a man more concerned with his reputation than with winning the war, while Montgomery countered in his own writings that Patton was a fundamentally unsound commander, whose methods were as dangerous as they were questionable. General Dwight D. Eisenhower found himself trapped in the center of this explosive personality clash, attempting to maintain the delicate balance of a coalition that was increasingly lopsided in terms of raw power. By March 1945, the United States had 61 divisions deployed in Northwest Europe, compared to Britain's 14, a disparity that made the British government's need for a distinct, high-profile victory all the more urgent for their national morale. Winston Churchill's cabinet desperately required a triumph that could be presented to a war-weary public as a British achievement, making Montgomery's planned crossing not just a military operation, but a vital piece of political theater intended to preserve Britain's status as a top-tier world power. As the deadline for Operation Plunder approached, Patton's Third Army surged toward the Rhine near the town of Oppenheim, finding the German defenses in a state of rapid, chaotic collapse as entire divisions surrendered en masse. Patton's intelligence officers reported that the eastern bank was held only by demoralized militia and scattered remnants of the Wehrmacht who possessed little ammunition and even less will to die for a lost cause. Seeing the opening he had craved for years, Patton summoned his corps commanders on the evening of March 21st and gave them instructions that were as simple as they were daring, grinning with the realization that he was about to pull off the greatest prank in military history. The plan was for the 5th Infantry Division to cross the river under the cover of absolute darkness on the night of March 22nd, eschewing the massive artillery barrages and airborne drops that Montgomery considered essential for success. Patton wanted a silent, efficient crossing that would present the world with a fait accompli before the first British shell had even been fired in the north, effectively cutting the legs out from under Montgomery's carefully staged media event. As the sun set on that fateful Thursday, American infantrymen began moving flimsy assault boats toward the water's edge, their hearts pounding, not just with the fear of the enemy, but with the weight of the historic gamble their commander was taking. At precisely 2201 hours, the first wave of American troops pushed off into the cold, dark current of the Rhine, their oars splashing softly in a silence that felt heavy with the potential for disaster. There was no thunderous roar of guns to announce their arrival, no paratroopers falling from the sky to secure the far bank, only the gritty determination of soldiers paddling toward a shoreline shrouded in mystery and the unknown strength of a desperate enemy. The German reaction when it finally came was sporadic and utterly confused, as the defenders had been conditioned to expect a massive bombardment before any serious attempt at a crossing, leaving them helpless against this sudden, shadowy intrusion. By the stroke of midnight, the 5th Division had successfully established 2 full battalions on the eastern bank and began digging in with frantic energy, realizing that the dawn would bring the inevitable German counterattacks. But as the first light of March 23rd touched the river, it became clear that the resistance was minimal and ineffective, allowing the Americans to rapidly expand their bridgehead and begin the process of ferrying tanks and heavy equipment across the water. At 700 hours, a triumphant Patton picked up the telephone to call Major General Omar Bradley, eager to share the news that would soon send Montgomery into a tailspin of professional jealousy and rage. Bradley received the news with a delight that was purely American, recognizing that Patton had secured a massive propaganda coup that would fundamentally shift the narrative of the final stages of the war in Europe. He immediately relayed the information to Eisenhower's headquarters. But even as the Supreme Commander processed the strategic implications, the political fallout was already beginning to simmer beneath the surface of the Allied High Command. To the north, Montgomery was still finalizing his press arrangements and polishing the speech he intended to deliver to the world, completely unaware that his rival had already crossed the impregnable moat and was currently preparing to document his triumph for the American newspapers. The contrast between the two operations could not have been more stark, as Montgomery's Operation Plunder began on schedule on the night of March 23rd with a preliminary bombardment that involved over 3,000 artillery pieces. The scale of the British effort was staggering, with 65,000 shells fired in the first hour alone, creating a roar so continuous and intense that it was reportedly heard by residents in London 400 miles away from the front lines. To Montgomery, this was the only way to conduct a proper military operation, a display of imperial might that left nothing to chance and everything to the crushing weight of industrial warfare. The following morning, the spectacle reached its zenith as 16,000 paratroopers descended from the sky in Operation Varsity, filling the horizon with silk canopies and the drone of transport planes in the largest single-day airborne drop ever recorded. Montgomery stood on the western bank alongside Winston Churchill, a phalanx of war correspondents full with the satisfaction of a man who believed he was witnessing his finest hour. He was the center of the world's attention, the architect of a grand victory, until a staff officer approached with the news that shattered his composure and turned his moment of triumph into a bitter pill of humiliation. Reports began to filter into the British headquarters that Patton's Third Army was not only across the Rhine, but had been established on the far side for over 24 hours without the need for a single airborne soldier or a massive artillery barrage. Montgomery's initial reaction was one of flat, cold disbelief, as he argued that such a feat was impossible and that the reports must be the result of American exaggeration or tactical confusion. When the news was confirmed beyond any shadow of a doubt, the Field Marshal's mood darkened visibly, and he began a desperate attempt to minimize the achievement, claiming that Patton's crossing lacked strategic significance and was merely an opportunistic raid against a vacant sector. Standing beside him, Winston Churchill felt the sting of the news even more acutely, as he realized that the headlines would now be dominated by an American general's speed rather than a British field marshal's meticulous planning. The Prime Minister had traveled to the front specifically to witness a crowning British achievement, but instead he found himself overshadowed by the very ally whose dominance he was trying to balance with British prestige. The tension on the riverbank was palpable as the airborne drops continued overhead, a magnificent display of power that suddenly felt redundant and unnecessarily costly in the face of Patton's silent, efficient success. On March 25th, Patton decided to twist the knife even further by crossing the Rhine himself on a temporary pontoon bridge, ensuring that a team of photographers was present to capture every second of his theatrical arrival on German soil. In a move calculated to evoke the legends of history, Patton deliberately stumbled as he stepped off the bridge, falling to his knees and scooping up a handful of German dirt in a conscious imitation of William the Conqueror. It was pure theater designed for the front pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post, a move that shouted to the world that while Montgomery was planning, Patton was winning, setting the stage for a confrontation that would require the direct intervention of the most powerful men in the world. The news of Patton's silent, opportunistic crossing at Oppenheim acted as a catalyst for a media firestorm that threatened to incinerate the remaining threads of Allied cooperation. When the morning newspapers reached the streets across America and Britain on March 26, the headlines were virtually unanimous in their proclamation that Patton was the first to cross the Rhine, a narrative that relegated Montgomery's massive, weeks-long preparation to a secondary status. This public perception was a devastating blow to the British Field Marshal, who had invested his entire professional reputation into the belief that Rhine crossing could only be achieved through a massive, methodical, set-piece battle. Montgomery reacted with visible darkening of his mood, an immediate, loud insistence that Patton's achievement didn't truly count because it was virtually unopposed and lacked the strategic scale of a full Army group operation. As the press celebrated Patton's speed, the American general himself did nothing to cool the tempers of his British counterpart, instead choosing to lean into his role as the cowboy of the Western Front. During an interview with war correspondents on March 27th, Patton delivered a line that would haunt Montgomery for years, dismissively stating that while some people need a full orchestra and a written score just to get out of bed in the morning, he only needed a bugle. He went on to argue that his men had proved you didn't need to drop 2 entire airborne divisions to cross a river. You simply needed guts and good infantrymen who knew their jobs. These comments were not just tactical observations, but precision-guided strikes at Montgomery's ego, intended to portray the British commander as an overcautious showman who wasted resources on unnecessary theatrics. The toxicity of this relationship began to paralyze the high command as Montgomery bombarded Eisenhower with demands that Patton be officially censured for making statements prejudicial to Allied unity. In a strongly worded message sent on March 28th, Montgomery described Patton's behavior as that of a child seeking attention and formally requested that Eisenhower order him to stop comparing their operations. Montgomery's desperation was rooted in the fear that his carefully constructed moment of triumph was crumbling, a collapse that would have profound implications for Britain's political standing in the post-war world. He continued to lobby the British Chiefs of Staff to minimize Patton's success, writing to Field Marshal Alan Brooke that the American success was essentially a subsidiary event to his own primary effort. General Dwight D. Eisenhower found himself in an impossible political vice, caught between the overwhelming material dominance of the United States and the essential strategic partnership with Great Britain. By this stage of the war, the Americans were providing the bulk of the men and equipment, with 61 divisions to Britain's 14, but Eisenhower knew that the alliance's survival depended on protecting British pride. He realized that Montgomery's constant demands for primacy and Patton's reckless public statements were turning the final offensive into a public scandal that could poison relations between London and Washington for generations. Eisenhower's struggle was no longer just about defeating the Wehrmacht. It was about managing 2 of the most difficult egos in military history before they tore the coalition apart from within. Winston Churchill, returning to London from the Rhine on March 30th, was decidedly not pleased with the unfolding drama. The Prime Minister was a hardened strategic realist who understood that while Britain had sacrificed enormously to reach this point, her future security was tied inextricably to the Atlantic Alliance. He watched with growing frustration as the press coverage portrayed the British Army as a slow, plodding force compared to Patton's lightning-fast Third Army, a narrative that threatened to diminish the hard-won victories of the British soldier. Churchill saw that the bickering between generals was making the Allied command look like fools on the world stage, while the war was still being fought and men were still dying. The crisis reached a boiling point on April 1st, when Churchill summoned an emergency meeting at 10 Downing Street with the British Chiefs of Staff. Opening the meeting by slamming the morning newspapers onto the table, Churchill declared with characteristic fire that this nonsense must stop immediately. He was particularly incensed by a message Montgomery had sent to Eisenhower and copied to Churchill, demanding a public statement that the Northern Crossing was the primary effort and all others were secondary. To Churchill, this was the final straw, a move that made the British leadership look absolutely ridiculous by prioritizing credit and status over the final destruction of Nazi Germany. On April 4th, the Prime Minister summoned Montgomery to London for a face-to-face confrontation that would become a legendary moment in military history. Montgomery arrived prepared to defend his meticulous planning and the strategic superiority of Operation Plunder, arguing that the press had been unfair to British achievements. Churchill, however, had no interest in hearing about operational details or technical superiority. He listened with growing impatience before cutting the Field Marshal off with brutal finality. In front of the assembled chiefs of staff, Churchill delivered a rebuke that stripped away Montgomery's pretenses, telling him that Patton had crossed the Rhine, he had crossed the Rhine, and even the Russians were crossing the Oder. Then came the line that would echo through the decades. Churchill told Montgomery that the only people who seemed unable to cross anything were his publicists, who were currently stuck trying to cross from envy to dignity. The room fell into an absolute chilling silence as Montgomery's face reportedly went white with the shock of the humiliation. The Prime Minister had just informed the highest-ranking British commander that his behavior was beneath the dignity of his office and was actively damaging the legacy of the British Army. Churchill's voice remained hard and uncompromising as he ordered Montgomery to congratulate Patton immediately and cease all comparisons between their operations. The Field Marshal was reminded that history would judge them on whether they won the war, not on who claimed the credit for crossing a specific river first. Left with no choice but to comply with direct order of his Prime Minister, Montgomery sent a brief, formal message to Patton on April 5th, offering congratulations on his successful crossing and rapid advance. Patton's response was outwardly gracious, though the private reality remained unchanged, as the American general reportedly told his aides that the message was a hollow gesture from a man who had been forced into submission. The immediate public crisis was over, but the damage to Montgomery's reputation within the high command and the press was lasting and significant. Even the Times of London joined the fray with an editorial that summarized the national feeling, stating that while Montgomery had nothing to apologize for in his conduct of operations, he owed his country an apology for allowing personal rivalry to overshadow professional achievement. Patton did not escape entirely unscathed either, as Eisenhower called him in for a private, stern reprimand on April 10th to address his reckless public statements and the friction they had caused. For Patton, the episode was a mixed blessing. He had won the battle of public opinion, but at the cost of further alienating the very superiors who would decide his post-war future. In the years following the war, Montgomery attempted to reconstruct his version of events in his 1958 memoirs, continuing to insist on the strategic necessity of his methods. However, historical consensus and the testimony of the German commanders themselves have been less kind to his self-serving narrative. General Siegfried Westphal, in a 1945 interrogation, confirmed that Patton's crossing had come as a complete and devastating surprise to the German High Command, proving the effectiveness of Patton's cowboy aggression over Montgomery's orchestra. The controversy remains a primary case study at military colleges worldwide, illustrating the complex intersection of military tactics, personal ego, and the political realities of coalition warfare. General George C. Marshall would later reflect that both Patton and Montgomery were fine commanders who shared the same tragic flaw, a failure to understand that the real achievement was not who crossed the river first. The true victory lay in the fact that the Allies crossed together and remained a unified force until the job was finished. This perspective was shared by the men on the ground, the soldiers who actually faced the cold water, and the German guns, for whom the petty arguments of generals seemed like a distant and irrelevant world. An American veteran of the crossing noted decades later that they were told to get across the Rhine. They did so, the British did the same, and the Germans lost. That was the only metric that mattered to the men in the mud. A British veteran echoed this sentiment, stating that he didn't care whether Patton crossed first, he cared about survival and the end of the war. These soldiers understood the fundamental truth that their commanders sometimes forgot. Wars are won by nations and coalitions, not by individuals pursuing personal glory. The Rhine crossing of 1945 serves as a powerful reminder that the hardest battles in any conflict aren't always fought with bullets and shells, but with pride and the need for recognition. It exposes the fundamental truth that in the heat of war, the ego of a leader can be as dangerous to an alliance as the weapons of the enemy. The story of Patton and Montgomery that warns us that the wisest generals aren't always the ones who win the most headlines, but the ones who know when to let the victory speak for itself. As we look back on these events, we see that the crossing of Hitler's last natural barrier was a collective triumph that marked the beginning of the end for the Nazi regime. While the rivalry between Patton and Montgomery provided a dramatic backdrop, it was the unified might of the Allied armies that ultimately broke the back of the Third Reich. This history teaches us that managing allies and controlling egos are just as critical to victory as managing logistics and strategy. If you were in Eisenhower's position, how would you have handled the public insults between Patton and Montgomery? Would you have fired one of them? Or was the risk to the alliance too great to take action? Let us know your strategy in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.